Hey there, dreamers. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the quiet corner of the internet where the grand tapestry of the past gently unfurls, offering a tranquil escape from the day's cacophony. Tonight our journey takes us to a place of profound significance, a city on the precipice of its final agonizing breath. Berlin, in the desperate twilight of April 1945, once the formidable heart of a vast ambitious empire, it was by then merely a desolate, crumbling arena of its own destruction, besieged relentlessly by Soviet forces from every shattered street and blackened alley. It's a somber chapter, certainly, but one that holds deep lessons about human endurance and the stark realities of collapse. As you settle deeper into the quiet comfort of your own space, this evening perhaps consider a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft like on this video. Only of course if these historical whispers find a welcome place in your thoughts and offer you a moment of peaceful contemplation. And do feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're currently drifting from tonight. Allow your mind to softly detach from the present as we journey back not to the grand narratives of victory or defeat, but to the visceral, moment-to-moment existence of a soldier caught in the maelstrom of a city teetering on the edge of the abyss. Within this urban charnel house, where every street corner seemed to exhale dust and the scent of pulverized stone, the established order had fractured into a million shards, leaving individuals to confront the raw systemic realities of a collapsing state and a land scourged by perpetual conflict. Imagine for a moment a world where the very framework of your society, its laws, its economy, its hierarchy simply cease to function, replaced by a brutal immediate logic of survival. The city's environment itself, you see, ceased to be a mere setting. It transformed into an active antagonist, a malevolent entity that challenged every aspect of human endurance. From the physical landscape of ruins where every step was a gamble against unseen dangers to the very air. Men breathed thick with the metallic tang of smoke, and the acrid stench of burning materials. Every element conspired against life. It was into this macro-level maelstrom, this vast churning vortex of destruction and despair, that every German soldier was plunged. Regardless of their former rank, their prior experience, or the life they had known, just weeks or months before, they were forced to navigate an existence stripped bare of all normalcy, reduced to a primal struggle for each successive breath. Against this backdrop of systemic collapse and an unforgiving urban landscape, the individual soldier's daily life was not a series of grand strategic maneuvers, but rather a relentless visceral struggle for sheer survival, marked by profound physical discomforts and desperate, often poignant attempts to maintain a semblance of humanity. Think about the most basic of human needs like shelter. In Berlin's twilight, the ruins offered only desperate, fleeting havens. These were typically foul-smelling cellars, subterranean spaces that felt less like a refuge and more like a grave with wallpaper, their very atmosphere clinging to you with an oppressive dampness. The stone walls, perpetually cold and slick with condensation, truly did seem to be weeping with moisture, each drop a silent tear for the dying city. And the air down there, it was thick, heavy and perpetually damp, like it's trying to rot you alive from the inside out. A chilling visceral sensation that permeated your clothes, your skin, even your very bones. This wasn't merely discomfort. It was a constant, almost suffocating physical assault on the senses, a perpetual reminder of the city's decay, of the pervasive, inescapable filth that had become the defining characteristic of existence. These underground spaces often choked with the stale breath of too many bodies, the lingering scent of kerosene from makeshift lamps and the faint, unsettling odour of decay offered only the most illusory and temporary protection against the unending deluge of shells and the ever-present threat of collapse. You might discover a flickering candle, its flame dancing nervously, or perhaps a cracked teacup miraculously intact on a splintered shelf, a poignant, almost absurd relic from a life that had ceased to exist, serving as a silent bitter jest amidst the rubble, emphasizing the profound disruption of daily life. That profound disruption of daily life where the very fabric of existence was torn asunder extended directly into the most fundamental spaces of survival. Above ground, what once stood as homes had often been reduced to mere skeletons of walls and shadow, stark hollowed-out monuments to a vanished world. Imagine stepping into the gaping maw of a building that once housed families now entirely exposed to the elements. Its roof gone, its front facade blown away, leaving only jagged teeth of brick and concrete against a perpetually smoke-laden sky. These weren't merely damaged structures. They were architectural ghosts, perpetually groaning and shifting, constantly shedding pulverized stone, like a fine grey ash, onto any occupants with every distant concussive blast. You'd feel that fine gritty dust settling on your hair, your clothes seeping into your very pores, adding yet another layer to the pervasive grime that became your second skin. The protection these structures offered was entirely illusory, a cruel trick played by the fractured cityscape, lulling you into a false sense of security before another rumble or distant explosion shattered the fragile calm, reminding you of their inherent fatal fragility. There was a profound, almost philosophical cruelty in seeking shelter in a place so utterly stripped of its original purpose, a space where every remaining shard of brick whispered of a life violently interrupted, a grim satire on the very concept of home. Whether you found yourself huddling in such a half-collapsed house, perhaps still noticing that peculiar detail like a cracked teacup, miraculously intact on a shattered windowsill, a bizarre relic of normalcy amidst utter desolation, or deeper within one of those putrid cellars reeking of kerosene and onions, the unfortunate and inescapable reality was that shared spaces offered absolutely no privacy. None. This was a concept utterly eradicated by the exigencies of total war. Imagine trying to find a moment of solitary thought, a sliver of personal peace when you were constantly surrounded by others, each bearing their own burdens of fear, fatigue, and gnawing hunger. These communal environments were steeped not just in physical discomfort, the persistent cold, the pervasive damp, the endless irritating dust, but also in a profound, unyielding filth that clung to everything: the air, the damp ground, your clothes, even your own skin. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale fear, and recycled breath, occasionally punctuated by the acrid smell of burning refuse, or the faint, sickly sweet odour of decay. You learned to ignore the constant low hum of whispered prayers, the restless shifting of bodies, the quiet coughs that echoed in the gloom. It became a new, harsh kind of normal, a perpetual sensory assault that steadily chipped away at your dignity, leaving little room for the subtle comforts or distinctions that once defined a personal existence. The collective desperate struggle for mere survival utterly subsumed all individual considerations, rendering cleanliness an impossible dream, and personal space an unimaginable luxury, stripping away the very essence of human separation. Yet amidst this landscape of profound discomfort and societal collapse, when human connection seemed a relic of a bygone era, there were fleeting, almost miraculous moments when a sliver of profound human kindness managed to penetrate the oppressive gloom, offering brief, desperately needed respites. Imagine the shock, the sheer unexpectedness of being drawn into a quiet, dim apartment, perhaps by an old woman whose eyes held a weary but unwavering compassion, a silent understanding of your plight. Here, away from the ceaseless roar of artillery and the pervasive stench of ruin, a single humble candle might cast flickering shadows against walls that for a precious moment offered sanctuary from the city's weeping damp. You might be offered a worn mattress, not plush by any means, but a surface that felt immeasurably soft and inviting compared to the cold, hard earth or splintered floorboards you'd grown accustomed to. This wasn't merely physical relief. It was a profound emotional contrast to the harsh realities outside a sudden oasis of humanity in a world that had become utterly inhuman. These were rare, potent instances where a stranger's simple, unasked-for gesture rekindled a fragile spark of hope, a poignant reminder that even in the city's final death, rattle, not all warmth had been extinguished. That quiet flicker of warmth, that poignant reminder that even in the city's final death rattle not all human kindness had been extinguished, offered a brief fragile respite from the overwhelming despair. You'd find yourself almost holding your breath in these moments, not from fear, but from a profound, almost forgotten sense of security, the kind that whispers of a world where empathy wasn't a gamble. It was a stark illumination of the enduring power of compassion, a silent rebellion against the dehumanizing forces of war. For a brief span, the ceaseless thrum of distant explosions would seem to soften the pervasive scent of burning debris, would momentarily dissipate, replaced by the faint comforting aroma of stale tea or old linens. This temporary sanctuary, a candle's fragile glow in the overwhelming darkness, spoke volumes about the resilience of the human spirit, about the quiet, unyielding refusal of some individuals to let their humanity be completely consumed by the surrounding inferno. It was a fleeting glimpse of what had been, and a desperate yearning for what might impossibly be again a profound counterpoint to the city's decay. However, such delicate moments of civilian compassion, fragile as they were often a distant, quickly fading memory once the inevitable occurred capture. Post-capture, the immediate shift in environment was jarring as the anarchic freedom of the crumbling city was replaced by a rigid, often brutal new order. The initial camp housing for many provided a stark, albeit structured form of shelter after the chaos of Berlin. Here the barracks were crude utilitarian spaces, often little more than flimsy wooden structures, where wooden planks stacked 3 high served as beds. Imagine the rough splintered surfaces, the unyielding hardness beneath you, offering no comfort, but at least a designated spot. There was a pervasive, inescapable smell that clung to every surface and permeated every breath, a blend of oil, sweat and fear, a constant olfactory reminder of your new reality and your collective shared fate. This was the scent of mass confinement of bodies packed together in close quarters, a grim cocktail that settled deep in your lungs and seemed to etch itself into your very consciousness. Despite the starkness, these rudimentary structures, entirely devoid of any comfort or aesthetic appeal, represented a fundamental shift from the unpredictable peril of the city. You no longer had to scavenge desperately for cover or huddle in crumbling ruins, always on edge for the next collapse or incoming shell. Instead, you were part of a new enforced order, albeit one that stripped you of all agency, where your very existence was reduced to a number, and your living conditions were dictated by the stark, unforgiving necessities of your captors. It was a harsh exchange, certainly, but for some, the mere presence of walls that wouldn't immediately crumble and a designated sleeping space, however uncomfortable, offered a strange form of psychological relief after the utter unpredictability of the battlefield. Yet as the relentless grind of captivity wore on, and the initial shock began to settle into a numbing routine, there often came a profound, almost unbelievable shift, a surprising glimmer of genuine if basic comfort. The eventual resettlement site for many offered a comparative luxury that felt like a tentative return to civilization after prolonged barbarity. Imagine stepping into wooden barracks that, instead of smelling perpetually of oil and fear, carried the faint reassuring scent of fresh sawdust and old rain. This was a smell of construction, of newness, even of nature rather than decay or despair, a subtle hint of regrowth after ruin. And the beds, no longer rough stacked planks that bit into your bones, but individual straw mattresses still firm, but offering a distinct improvement in softness. And then the ultimate luxury and item almost forgotten from another life, real blankets. Not a tattered coat, not a flimsy scrap scavenged from debris, but actual woven blankets designed to offer warmth and a comforting weight. This represented a profound, almost seismic shift towards genuine, if still rudimentary, comfort. It wasn't about lavishness. It was about the restoration of basic human needs, a quiet signal that your existence, though still confined, was now deemed worthy of a modicum of warmth rest and a fleeting sense of security. This subtle upgrade in living conditions often triggered a deep emotional relief, a quiet loosening of the tension that had held your body rigid for so long, a tangible sign that the immediate brutal struggle for mere shelter had mercifully abated, replaced by a controlled but significantly less punishing routine, marking a shift towards a more predictable existence. That shift towards a more predictable existence, even if still within the confines of captivity, brought with it a subtle yet profound change in the texture of daily life. The tangible sign that the immediate brutal struggle for mere shelter had mercifully abated, replaced by a controlled but significantly less punishing routine, was mirrored in the most fundamental human need: sustenance. In Berlin's dying days, sustenance was not a comforting ritual, not a source of pleasure, but a constant gnawing void, a persistent emptiness that transcended mere physical sensation. Hunger transformed from a temporary pang, a fleeting discomfort, into a low, dull ache that's become part of your identity. It wasn't just a physical feeling, it was a psychological state, a constant, insidious companion that seemed to shrink your stomach, and more disturbingly seemed to soften your mind like fog, making coherent thought a luxury, a challenging feat in a landscape of perpetual need. Every decision, every movement, every flicker of hope or despair was underscored by this persistent, all-consuming emptiness. You carried it with you everywhere you went, a burden heavier than any pack, more pervasive than the dust that coated every surface. It coloured your perceptions, dulled your senses to everything but the desperate primal need for calories, and narrowed your world to the immediate agonising question of where the next bite, however meagre, might possibly come from. This wasn't the kind of hunger you might feel after skipping a meal, the kind that a quick snack could alleviate. This was systemic, body-altering deprivation that reshaped your very being, a constant internal siren call demanding nourishment that simply wasn't there, a relentless internal antagonist that gnawed at your soul. In those last desperate days in Berlin, when the sirens wailed and buildings imploded, food truly meant desperate improvisations, stark, grim reminders of a world utterly devoid of normalcy. You might find yourself gnawing on something as unappetizing as a turnip boiled in water, no salt, no fat. Imagine that, the bland fibrous texture, utterly devoid of flavour, a mere mockery of nourishment chewed slowly to extract every last meagre calorie. Or perhaps if fortune offered a fleeting smile, you'd be lucky enough to come across a crust of bread, hard as concrete, so unyielding that it tastes like dust and a bad decision, with every laborious jaw-raking bite. These weren't meals in any traditional sense. They were grim, almost ritualistic acts of survival, performed in silence with eyes darting nervously for threats. The formal rations, if they ever truly existed in the chaos of Berlin's final collapse, had long since been depleted, leaving soldiers to scavenge beg or simply endure the relentless pangs of starvation. Every single morsel, no matter how unappetizing, how meagre, or how difficult to obtain, was precious weighed against the immense effort required to find it, and consumed with a desperate slowness, as if to prolong the fleeting sensation of something, anything entering your stomach. This wasn't about savouring a meal. It was about the raw, brutal mechanics of staying alive one tasteless, joyless bite at a time, a stark testament to the profound, all-encompassing scarcity that governed their very existence. The very concept of satiety had become a distant, almost mythical dream replaced by the constant low-grade hum of emptiness. Such profound scarcity, such relentless hunger that seemed to chew at your very insides inevitably drove soldiers to extreme measures, blurring the lines between what was conventionally considered edible and what was simply a desperate, perhaps even macabre, fantasy. There were grim jokes, or perhaps just grim thoughts whispered in the deep quiet of a cellar about boiling boots for leather soup, the kind of darkly humorous consideration that only prolonged starvation could conjure. Your eyes might be drawn almost against your will to a truly horrifying sight, a stiff and bloated dead horse lying in the street, its grotesque form a constant grim reminder of hunger's extremes. It was a ghastly sight, certainly, but in its sheer, if unappetizing abundance, it whispered of forbidden feasts of a desperate primal source of sustenance that beckoned from the edge of sanity. The risk of approaching such a grim bounty, of course, was immense. potential enemy fire disease, or simply the desperate scramble of others. But the mere fact that it even crossed a starving mind spoke volumes about the depths of their desperation, about the erosion of all civilized inhibitions. This wasn't merely a lack of food. It was a constant, almost hallucinatory struggle with the very concept of sustenance, where every potential source, no matter how repulsive, became a subject of agonizing internal debate, a battle waged not just against the enemy, but against your own body's insistent demands. That internal battle waged against your own body's insistent demands was momentarily quieted, perhaps even silenced, in those rare, profoundly moving instances when small provisions were discovered. These finds were so unlikely, so precious, that they felt less like mere food and more like minor miracles, whispered blessings from a world that had seemingly forgotten them. Imagine the profound suspicion that would accompany the discovery of a hidden tin of fish and crackers, perhaps unearthed from the debris of a shelled building, or found tucked away in a forgotten corner of a crumbling cellar. Was it poisoned? A trap? A cruel jest? Yet the relentless, gnawing hunger often overcame any lingering doubts, forcing a desperate gamble. But it was the discovery of something as seemingly insignificant, as utterly mundane in peacetime as a single sugar cube, that could become a truly transformative moment. This wasn't just a simple carbohydrate. It was perceived as a diamond, its crystalline structure reflecting a fragile, almost ethereal hope in a world devoid of light. Its taste slow to dissolve on a parched tongue was something close to life. Amidst the desolation, a sudden, powerful surge of pure, uncomplicated sweetness that seemed to jolt the very soul. It stirred deep emotion, perhaps a fleeting, poignant memory of childhood innocence, of forgotten abundance, or simply the profound, overwhelming sensation of something good, something pure entering your body in a world utterly stripped of goodness. It was a brief but intensely profound connection to a lost past, a fleeting glimpse of simple pleasure, a poignant reminder of what the body and indeed the soul truly craved in the midst of overwhelming hardship. This fleeting taste of something close to life, that single precious sugar cube, quickly dissolved, replaced all too soon by the grim, unappetizing reality of captivity's rations. In the bleak, monotonous world of the labour camp, meals were a stark, dreary repetition, often consisting of nothing more than potato peels boiled into sludge. Imagine the pale, lukewarm consistency, often sour to the taste, a thin, unappetizing liquid that offered little comfort, but provided the bare minimum of essential, if uninspiring calories needed to keep your body functioning. You learn to slurp it down slowly, drawing out the process not for enjoyment, for there was none to be found, but as if to make the blanket made of sadness last longer, to somehow stretch the brief moment of consumption into something more substantial, to defer the inevitable return of hunger for as long as possible. There was no joy in these meals, no social ceremony, no shared camaraderie, just the quiet collective act of survival, the scraping of spoons against tin bowls, each man focused entirely on the grim task of ingesting enough to simply keep going to face another day of endless toil. This was sustenance reduced to its most basic utilitarian form, utterly devoid of any pleasure, any cultural significance or any hint of human warmth, a stark testament to the dehumanizing efficiency of the camp system, where individuality was stripped away, and bodies were merely fueled for labour. But then, as if emerging from a long dark dream, or stepping from a monochrome photograph into vibrant colour, the resettlement site for some brought with it the profound, almost tearful return of real food. Imagine soup with actual meat. Not just boiled peels or thin, murky broth, but tangible chunks of something substantial, something that offered genuine texture and flavour, a luxury almost forgotten. And then the unparalleled luxury, the almost unbelievable treat, bread with a spoonful of jam, real jam. The sweetness was almost overwhelming, a forgotten sensation that jolted the senses, sparking memories of a time when such simple delights were commonplace. For many prisoners, this wasn't just about nutrition. It was a powerful psychological breakthrough, a quiet signal that they were perhaps once again seen as human beings deserving of more than mere subsistence. The emotional responses were often profound, ranging from quiet, tearful gratitude to an almost childlike wonder at the simple abundance at the return of something so basic yet so deeply comforting. This tangible shift in diet was more than just calories entering a starved body. It was a profound emotional and psychological marker, signalling a tentative return to nourishment that stirred deep, often tearful emotional responses from the prisoners, a palpable step back towards a world where food could once again be a source of comfort, perhaps even a fleeting moment of joy rather than just a grim necessity, hinting at the gradual restoration of dignity. That gradual restoration of dignity hinted at by the return of real food extended beyond the mere act of eating to the forgotten rituals of personal care, a subtle but significant shift in the human experience. This painstaking journey from total deprivation to the rudimentary comforts of the resettlement camp also extended crucially to the realm of personal hygiene. In the chaos of Berlin's final days, when survival was the only directive, personal hygiene dissolved amidst the widespread anarchy. It became an unimaginable luxury utterly superseded by the brutal immediate demands of staying alive. Days, perhaps even weeks, could pass without the simple act of brushing your teeth, your mouth a perpetual landscape of dry metallic grit, a constant reminder of unwashedness. Your body, regardless of who you were before, what your status had been or what you had done, became perpetually coated in a fine pervasive dust that fills your mouth, your nose, your soul. It wasn't just superficial dirt. It felt like an internal corruption, a tangible manifestation of the city's decay, a reflection of an existence where care for oneself was not only forgotten, but became utterly irrelevant in the face of immediate existential threats. The very notion of cleanliness became a concept as distant and abstract as peace itself, replaced by a constant, inescapable layer of grime that seemed to seep into every pore, every thought. That pervasive dust, that constant gritty companion in your mouth and soul, was merely one facet of the pervasive physical discomforts that defined existence in Berlin during its last gasps. Your entire body became a landscape of unrelenting aches and pains, a testament to constant strain, chronic fatigue, and profound neglect. Imagine your knees perpetually aching from endless crouching, scrambling over rubble, and lying on unforgiving surfaces, each movement a minor torment. Your limbs felt stiff, heavy and unresponsive from days without proper rest, making every attempt to stretch or move feel like a monumental effort. Your eyes, too, would become grainy like they'd been filled with ash, perpetually irritated by the dust smoke and lack of sleep, making the already grim landscape appear even more blurred, distorted and menacing. And perhaps one of the most maddening minor torments, a small detail that spoke volumes about dehydration, was the persistently parched mouth, a constant irritating sensation that struggled to produce even wet spit. A simple biological function now rendered difficult, emphasizing the constant low-grade physical torment that became the baseline of your existence. Every breath, every movement, every fleeting attempt at rest was a reminder of this profound physical agony, an unending test of human endurance, where even the simplest bodily functions became a struggle against the relentless corrosive forces of war and neglect. Amidst this relentless physical torment, this landscape of aching limbs and dust-filled eyes, brief, almost desperate attempts at cleanliness became rare, almost ritualistic acts of defiance against the encroaching filth. You might find yourself against all odds stumbling upon an icy stream or a shallow puddle of relatively clean water. The sheer cold of it, sharp and shocking against your skin, was immediate and biting, certainly, but surprisingly it feels good on your skin. A momentary jolt of sensory input that wasn't about pain or fear, but about a fleeting sense of refreshing purity. You would scrub off the visible grey streaks of ingrained dirt, not with soap, which was a mythical substance, but with the sheer force of your palm, a crude, almost primal effort. It was a makeshift primitive method, yet it felt like a symbolic cleansing. a brief fleeting moment of regaining a minuscule piece of your former self, washing away not just the physical grime, but perhaps a tiny fraction of the pervasive despair that clung to you, a psychological burden as heavy as the dust itself. These were not acts of comprehensive hygiene designed for thorough cleaning, but desperate, almost instinctual attempts to reconnect with a lost sense of self, a poignant reminder of a time when personal care was a normal, unquestioned part of life, a quiet assertion of dignity against overwhelming odds. The profound scarcity of basic personal goods only underscored the depths of this deprivation, turning everyday items into unattainable luxuries. Items that you once took for granted, a simple bar of soap, a comb to tame unruly hair, were virtually non-existent, making their sudden, unexpected appearance in something as unlikely as a Red Cross box a significant, almost miraculous event. Imagine finding a small wrapped bar of soap, perhaps a comb with a few missing teeth, or even a small tarnished mirror. These weren't just objects. They were relics from a forgotten world imbued with an almost sacred significance, capable of sparking a profound emotional response. Their arrival highlighted the profound level of deprivation experienced, transforming these mundane everyday items into treasures that sparked genuine, albeit quiet, wonder and gratitude. It was a stark illustration of how the war had inverted value systems, rendering the once mundane into the profoundly precious, turning a simple comb into a symbol of incredible, almost unattainable luxury, a tangible link to a world that seemed to have vanished forever, and a chilling reflection of oneself. That chilling reflection of oneself, glimpsed in a tarnished mirror or a murky puddle, often presented a startlingly altered image, a profound testament to the war's indelible mark. Catching your reflection in the icy stream after attempting that symbolic, almost desperate cleansing could be a profoundly disquieting, even jarring experience. The face staring back wasn't the one you remembered. It was an older, hardened visage, version of yourself that survived another 10 years without aging well, despite the passage of only a few weeks or months. Lines of fatigue and stress etched themselves around eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held a profound weariness. The gauntness of hunger had sharpened your features into something almost unfamiliar, angular and stark, transforming your appearance into a grim testament to the relentless hardship. It was a stark, unflinching confrontation with the physical toll of unrelenting war, a sudden brutal awareness of how completely you'd been transformed almost beyond recognition. The image was unsettling, almost alien, prompting an instinctive physical gesture to splash the image away, as if by disturbing the water's surface you could somehow obliterate this unsettling new reality, or at least momentarily blur it into oblivion. It was a profound moment of disconnect, an inability to reconcile the past self, the person you were before Berlin, before the dust and the hunger, with the hardened, weary survivor reflected in the murky water. This fragmented reflection wasn't just about appearance. It was about a profound loss of self, a chilling realization that the person you once were had been irrevocably altered, leaving behind only this scarred older version unable to recognize or truly accept the profound changes wrought by the conflict, a silent testament to the war's enduring psychological impact. And yet, even amidst this profound loss of self and pervasive despair, when the world seemed to conspire to strip away every last vestige of dignity, there was a quiet, almost ritualistic gesture that hinted at a subtle, almost subconscious return to a sense of order and personal dignity. This was a dignity not just for oneself, but extended to the few remaining personal belongings in a world that had stripped everything of intrinsic value. The act of meticulously cleaning one's boots, even when utterly exhausted, when your body screamed for rest, or perhaps for no clear immediate tactical reason, became a profound, almost therapeutic ritual. Imagine the steady, rhythmic motion of wiping away the caked-on dust and grime, rubbing at scuffs, perhaps even polishing them with a scrap of cloth if one could be found. This wasn't about military regulations which had long ceased to matter. It was about imposing order on chaos, about tending to something tangible and controllable in a crumbling world. It suggested a faint, almost subconscious yearning to reclaim a modicum of self-respect, to invest care and effort into the few possessions that remained, treating them not just as tools, but as extensions of a fragile, enduring self. This quiet act, performed perhaps in the dim, stale light of a cellar, or under the open, indifferent sky, was a powerful unspoken affirmation of human resilience, a small yet profound act of self-care, in a world that offered none hinting at a nascent desire to reconstruct a fragmented identity, one polished boot at a time, a silent testament to the enduring human need for order. This painstaking effort to maintain dignity through small acts of self-care was, of course, just a fraction of the relentless, physically demanding labour that defined combat survival in Berlin. Every single day was a desperate, exhausting struggle against overwhelming odds, a grim testament to the sheer physical toll of urban warfare in its most brutal form. You were constantly reacting, your body tensing, then hitting the ground with a jarring impact to avoid incoming shells, the shockwave vibrating through your very bones, threatening to liquefy your insides. You crawled, or rather slithered on elbows and knees, through vast fields of treacherous rubble, each jagged shard of concrete a potential wound, each twisted piece of rebar a snagging hazard, every movement a calculated risk. And then the running. Frantic, desperate sprints from one fleeting cover to another, from explosion to explosion, your body operating purely on fumes and old memories, pushing past the limits of what you thought was physically possible, sustained only by a primal will to live. It was a never-ending cycle of exertion, fear and pain, a brutal testament to the physical endurance required simply to exist, and a grim prelude to the even more profound exhaustion of constant vigilance. That brutal physical endurance, pushing your body to run on fumes and old memories, was just one facet of the demanding, brutal labour that defined a soldier's existence in Berlin's dying days. Beyond the immediate physical acts of survival, the crawling, the running, the ducking, the primary labour of a Berlin soldier was an unceasing, mentally exhausting vigilance. Imagine peering endlessly through fractured windows or over precarious piles of debris, your eyes straining in the perpetual twilight, searching for the telltale glint of a sniper's scope, or tracking unseen Soviet movements through the labyrinthine ruins, the constant tension gnawing at your nerves like a persistent, insidious itch. Sleep became a near-mythical concept, stolen in minimal fragmented increments, not more than an hour at a time in 5 days, for many a horrifying testament to the chronic sleep deprivation. This lack of proper rest compounded the mental strain, blurring the lines between waking and dreaming, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish genuine threats from the ghosts of your own exhaustion, leading to a pervasive sense of unreality. The pervasive mental tension of waiting, simply waiting for the next attack, the next shell to drop, the next unseen enemy to emerge, created a psychological burden almost as heavy as the physical one. It was a constant state of high alert, a perpetual readiness for violence that left no room for relaxation or mental respite, turning every quiet moment into a prelude of terror, a taut string stretched to its breaking point. Wounds, of course, were common, almost an expected part of this brutal existence, a grim souvenir of merely existing in the city. A bleeding leg with embedded metal fragments, a painful memento from a near miss, would become a daily companion, constantly throbbing, a persistent reminder of your vulnerability, often left untended due to lack of medical supplies. But beyond the visible, often festering injuries, there were the persistent aches of a body aged 50 years overnight, a profound sense of physical deterioration that defied the actual passage of time. Even a brief attempt at rest brought no relief, your limbs stiff like you've aged 50 years overnight, each joint protesting with every movement and your neck screaming, with pain from holding unnatural positions, constantly craning to scan the desolate landscape for threats. These weren't just isolated injuries that would eventually heal, they were the cumulative grinding toll of endless combat, chronic sleep deprivation, and relentless physical strain transforming the human body into a landscape of chronic suffering, a walking testament to the war's relentless attrition. Every movement was a chore, every moment of stillness, a shallow and adequate attempt at recovery, a constant battle against the relentless march of physical decay that seemed to accelerate with each passing hour. In this overwhelming chaos where every second was a fight for survival, formal military duties blurred into desperate improvisation, a grim parody of organised military order. Unit structures had utterly collapsed. The grand divisions and regiments existed only on paper if they existed at all. Their remnants scattered and disconnected. Soldiers found themselves operating in small, isolated and often leaderless groups, left to simply drift following the person in front of them, their primal survival instincts replacing any semblance of tactical planning or coordinated effort. They were holding arbitrary lines next to non-existent landmarks, or guarding hallways with Panzerfausts instead of fixing planes, or coordinating supply runs tasks for which they were never trained, performed out of desperate necessity. The very purpose of their military training, once so meticulously instilled, became twisted into these ad hoc, desperate acts of self-preservation. There was no grand strategy, no coherent command, just the immediate visceral need to survive the next 5 minutes, the next shell, the next sniper's shot, a descent into a primal form of warfare where roles were dissolved into pure chaotic survival. And the only true duty was the grim, relentless act of staying alive. This chaotic breakdown of formal roles would soon be replaced by a new, harsh form of labour. That chaotic breakdown of formal roles where the grim, relentless act of staying alive was the only true duty eventually gave way to a new, equally brutal, yet strangely structured form of labour once soldiers were captured. In captivity, labour became physically punishing and seemingly unending, stripped of any pretense of purpose beyond the sheer imposition of will by the victorious Soviets. Imagine spending your days shoveling gravel, the coarse, jagged stones grating against your worn boots, your back aching with every swing of the shovel, each motion a protest from your exhausted muscles, or sweeping endless fields of broken glass shards, the remnants of shattered windows and mirrors, each movement a careful, painstaking dance to avoid cutting yourself on the omnipresent debris of a ruined city, a constant threat to your already battered feet and hands. You dragged heavy timber, splintered and unwieldy your shoulders, protesting with every strained step the rough wood biting into your skin. And perhaps most Sisyphean of all, you were rebuilding roads, filling craters, left by shells, patching up a shattered landscape, all under the relentless gaze of guards. You understood implicitly that it doesn't matter if your back aches or your feet bleed. Your personal discomfort was irrelevant. The physical pain was secondary. The work was simply endless, a relentless, soul-crushing cycle that offered no respite, no moment of genuine rest, designed not just to rebuild the physical infrastructure, but to break the spirit, a constant physical reminder of your subjugated state of the overwhelming power of your captors. Yet as the immediate searing memory of the war receded into a painful, if still vivid memory, and the initial brutal shock of captivity slowly gave way to a fragile new order, a surprising, almost therapeutic shift began to occur in the nature of this forced labour. Post-war work, even when coerced and driven by the needs of the occupiers, gradually instilled a new kind of discipline, one that paradoxically offered a new constructive purpose. Building fences, perhaps gardening a small plot of land to grow meagre vegetables, or engaging in carpentry. These tasks, though, imposed gradually fostered a subtle sense of meaning. Imagine the careful, precise motion of planing a board, the fragrant wood shavings curling away to reveal a smooth, unblemished surface beneath your hands, or the focused concentration required to sand rough edges until they became soft and tactile beneath your fingers. This wasn't just work, it was honest work, carrying a subtle, almost therapeutic sense of building, rather than breaking of creation, rather than destruction. It was a tangible creation, a quiet act of making something whole again, of bringing order to chaos, providing a profound emotional shift from the destructive chaos of war, a tentative step towards healing. Each nail hammered, each seed planted, each smooth piece of wood produced, represented a tiny step away from the abyss of despair, a quiet affirmation of life's enduring capacity for renewal, for building a future from the shattered past. This profound transformation from the brutal, improvised vocational skills of war, the art of scavenging the grim mechanics of fighting, to the constructive discipline of rebuilding, highlighted the devastating impact of conflict on an entire generation's formative years. The profound, heartbreaking loss of innocence was brutally evident everywhere you looked, etched onto the very faces of those pressed into service. You'd see the haunting presence of teenagers with rifles too big for their hands, their youthful frames struggling to bear the weight of their grim new reality, their eyes holding a wisdom far beyond their years. Or the even more chilling, tragically common sight of a teenage boy who lay slumped dead in the rubble, wearing in a cruel irony his school blazer as his uniform. This wasn't just a grim testament to childhood obliterated. It was a visceral, horrifying image of stolen futures of young lives, prematurely ended before they had even truly begun, a generation consumed before it had a chance to bloom, before they could taste the full promise of adulthood. The school blazer, a poignant symbol of learning, of potential, of a future filled with knowledge, became a shroud, a stark, undeniable reminder of innocence violently stripped away, replaced by the grim, ill-fitting uniform of an unwilling combatant, a profound tragedy, etched in fabric and blood. The true cost of war often rests most heavily on the younger shoulders. That profound tragedy, etched in fabric and blood, indeed rested most heavily on the younger shoulders, manifesting in the desperate innocence still clinging to the edges of unimaginable horror. You'd frequently see young, newly conscripted Volkssturm members, some so fresh-faced they still had braces on their teeth, attempting to whistle tunes, perhaps old folk songs or popular melodies from a world that had vanished a world before. This wasn't genuine merriment, you understood. It was a heartbreaking, almost defiant, desperate attempt to pretend none of this is happening, to cling to a fragile semblance of normalcy amidst the city's terminal, agonizing collapse. Their fragile, often tuneless whistles were a poignant counterpoint to the relentless percussive roar of artillery, a stark demonstration of youth's inherent yearning for lightness, for beauty, even in the very darkest hours. This desperate performance, a fragile shield against the brutal reality that constantly threatened to overwhelm them, highlighted the profound tragedy of a generation forced to trade playgrounds and classrooms for battlefields and crumbling ruins, their youthful exuberance crushed under the inexorable weight of an unimaginable conflict. It spoke volumes about the human spirit's almost pathological capacity for denial, even when faced with the most undeniable visceral horrors that surrounded them at every turn, a grim coping mechanism in an impossible situation. The profound toll on the youngest, however, extended brutally beyond merely conscripted boys and into the civilian populace. The sight of a 6-year-old civilian girl who lost her leg to the indiscriminate shelling lying there with no morphine left to ease her agony underscored the brutal, indiscriminate nature of the war's suffering, a suffering that spared no one regardless of age or innocence. Yet even in such profound physical pain, her resilience was described chillingly as cement, a stark testament to the unimaginable fortitude of children forced to endure unspeakable trauma, their small bodies bearing burdens that would crush an adult. She suffered silently, her small face a mask of endurance, her body racked with pain, a quiet testament to a strength that defied comprehension, to a spirit that refused to break. Her enduring spirit, even in the face of such catastrophic loss and agonizing pain, served as a stark, horrifying reminder that innocence was absolutely no shield against the city's merciless destruction, but also, paradoxically, that hope, however fragile and tenuous, could find purchase even in the deepest wells of despair, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness offering a faint promise of a future beyond the ruins. In Berlin's final throes, there was no semblance of formal education to be found amidst the cacophony of shells and the dust of collapsing buildings. The traditional classroom, with its orderly rows of desks, its books and blackboards, its promise of a future, had been utterly obliterated. Instead, the only lessons learned were the brutal vocational skills of war itself, the desperate art of scavenging for food in the ruins, the grim immediate tactics of street fighting, and the constant weary art of navigating a treacherous landscape of rubble and unexploded ordnance. These were the new curricula taught not by nurturing teachers but by the raw, unforgiving exigencies of survival, each mistake potentially fatal. The very memory of a childhood spent with books like Max and Moritz, with their cheerful rhymes and innocent mischief, now felt jarringly out of place, even wrong. Too cheerful, a cruel, almost mocking anachronism in a world so utterly divorced from joy, from lightness, from peace. The contrast was profound, emphasizing the complete inversion of priorities, where the brutal reality of survival eclipsed all intellectual pursuits, and the grim, visceral realities of combat became the sole, inescapable education, etching themselves onto the very souls of those who endured them, shaping their very being. That grim, visceral education of combat, etching itself onto the very souls of those who endured it slowly and painfully, began to yield to a different kind of learning in the aftermath, a faint echo of the world that once was. The jarring contrast between a remembered innocent childhood and the brutal reality of war's vocational skills began to soften, albeit tentatively, in the post-war landscape like a slow-motion thaw after a long, brutal winter. The emergence of a school in the resettlement village was a profoundly significant development. Not just a building, but a fragile but powerful return to the very possibility of learning a tangible beacon of hope for a future for the next generation. Imagine the quiet, almost sacred murmur of children's voices learning to read the scratch of chalk on a makeshift blackboard, the rustle of rudimentary paper, sounds that had been utterly absent from Berlin's final days, replaced by screams and explosions. For a former soldier like Weiss, the opportunity to become a helper, to stand before a young boy and teach him to count in German, was more than just a task. It symbolized a profound shift. It was a quiet, profound engagement with the rebuilding of minds and spirits rather than just roads and bridges. This act, small and seemingly mundane in its execution, represented a fragile but potent return to the very idea of education, offering a glimmer of hope that the brutal cycle of violence might be broken, and that the children of this ruined generation might yet have a chance at a different kind of future, one built on knowledge, not conflict. And then a rare, profound sight that could almost bring tears to the eyes, a stark and beautiful anomaly in a world still bearing the scars of immense devastation, the glimpse of actual children who laugh somewhere as they chase a makeshift ball through the trees after the war. This wasn't a fading memory from a bygone era. It was a present reality, a jarring, almost unbelievable glimpse of lost innocence slowly, tentatively returning to the world, like flowers pushing through cracked pavement. Their laughter light and unburdened, unfiltered by fear or sorrow, contrasted sharply with the echoing artillery of the past, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that felt almost alien after years of grim silence and mournful sighs. It was a profound emotional contrast, a vivid illustration that despite the cataclysm that had swept over the land, life persisted, and with it the simple, undeniable, almost defiant capacity for joy. This seemingly small moment was a powerful, almost sacred symbol of rebirth, a quiet testament to the enduring human spirit, a gentle whisper that even after the deepest ruin, the world could once again be filled with the uninhibited sound of children at play, a promise of renewal beyond comprehension. This raw sensory reality of daily existence, experienced through the pervasive dust, the gnawing hunger, the desperate search for shelter, and the fragile moments of kindness and rediscovered joy, was inextricably shaped by the broader foundational realities of a society fracturing under the immense crushing weight of total war. Indeed, the individual's desperate struggle, the constant battle for survival, the physical and emotional toll was merely a microcosm of the catastrophic, macro-level conditions that had utterly redefined Berlin. In this dying metropolis, established hierarchies crumbled into dust, formal economies vanished without a trace, and nature's fury in the form of ceaseless bombardment and urban decay seemed to collude with human destruction, creating an apocalyptic landscape. It was a city where the very concept of social order was rewritten not by decree or democratic process, but by the relentless, brutal hand of conflict, a transformation that began with the dissolution of its once rigid social hierarchy, a collapse from within mirroring the destruction without. That collapse from within mirroring the destruction without meant that the once rigid social hierarchy, the very bedrock of the Reich, had, by April 1945, transformed into something utterly unrecognisable, dissolving from a semblance of order into anarchic pockets of desperation. The traditional military hierarchy, with its clear chain of command, its meticulously defined ranks and its well-organised divisions, had largely ceased to exist on the ground in any meaningful way. Divisions might still be named on old maps, but they were often merely nominal, existing as fragmented remnants, their actual fighting components scattered and disconnected. Officers, the very embodiment of command and control, were either missing dead, fled, or holed up, somewhere in the subterranean labyrinth of bunkers and cellars, leaving their soldiers as disconnected, leaderless pockets of panic, without any coherent command structures to guide them. Imagine the profound disorientation the familiar ranks and roles, once absolute and unquestionable, now utterly meaningless in the face of imminent destruction. This wasn't merely a breakdown of discipline. It was a complete societal atomization, where the individual soldier was left adrift, responsible for their own immediate survival, rather than adhering to any grand strategic design. The absence of effective visible leadership fostered a pervasive sense of abandonment, leaving each man to grapple with a terrifying autonomy in a world that offered no guidance, only relentless peril, and the omnipresent threat of death. The desperate defence of Berlin, a city quite literally bleeding out its last reserves of manpower and material, relentlessly conscripted every societal stratum into its final futile stand. This led to a grim, almost surreal blurring of lines between civilian and combatant, a stark illustration of the absolute breakdown of traditional societal roles and distinctions. Old men and teenagers, many still wearing their school blazers, a chilling detail that spoke volumes about lost youth and shattered innocence, were armed as Volkssturm hastily formed militia units cobbled together from anyone capable of holding a rifle. These weren't trained professional soldiers. They were grandfathers and boys pulled abruptly from their daily lives, given a basic weapon, and unceremoniously pushed into the crucible of urban warfare. This wasn't a strategic deployment based on military necessity. It was a desperate, all-encompassing conscription, turning every citizen, regardless of age, gender, or prior experience, into a potential combatant. The normal long-established distinctions between civilian life and military service simply vanished, highlighting the total breakdown of societal order, where even a quiet life was no protection. You were either fighting, dying, or desperately trying to survive in a city where every street corner was a potential front line, every alley a choke point, every building a possible grave. And the highest levels of governance, figures like the Führer, rumoured to be holed up in the impenetrable Führer bunker deep beneath the city. Their presence, their very existence, held absolutely no personal meaning or motivation, no inspirational sway for the frontline soldier. Imagine yourself crouched in a reeking damp cellar, the earth above trembling with the ceaseless concussions of shells exploding overhead, your stomach gnawing with the relentless pangs of hunger. The abstract idea of a distant leader issuing decrees and pronouncements from an unreachable underground bunker felt utterly irrelevant, an absurd, almost satirical abstraction, in the face of immediate, visceral, life-threatening dangers. There was a vast chasm, an unbridgeable gulf between theoretical command and the lived brutal reality of urban warfare, a complete disconnect between the grand pronouncements of the Reich and the grim moment-to-moment struggle for survival. For the soldier on the ground, motivation came not from ideology, not from loyalty to a distant, unseen authority, but from the primal, unyielding instinct to stay alive, to perhaps protect the person next to you, or simply the desperate animal inertia of continued existence, clinging to life for one more breath. The very notion of a functioning government, much less one capable of inspiring a dying city to fight on, had become a hollow echo, utterly devoid of resonance or meaning for those truly bearing the crushing brunt of the war. That profound disconnect between distant authority and immediate reality would soon redefine civilian roles in the city. That profound disconnect between distant authority and immediate reality would soon redefine civilian roles in the city, dragging them further into the conflict's grim embrace. This vast chasm between theoretical command and the brutal lived reality meant that civilians, once considered apart from the military sphere, became inextricably woven into the very fabric of the war zone. They were not distant beneficiaries or mere victims. They were active, if unwilling, participants in the chaos, sharing the same brutal realities as the soldiers. Civilians sought shelter in the same putrid, damp cellars as the soldiers, their fear and desperation palpable in the shared gloom, their whispered prayers mingling with the exhausted sighs of the troops. They navigated the same rubble-strewn streets meticulously, picking their way through the debris, dodging falling masonry and bursting shells, all in a desperate quest for basic survival, foraging for meagre food, searching for drinkable water, or simply seeking a marginally safer place amidst the ceaseless bombardment. Interactions with the remaining troops, however, were often met with indifferent suspicion, or even outright hostility. There was little sympathy to spare for anyone, soldier or civilian. Everyone was simply another suffering soul, in a city defined by suffering, their fates intertwined in a grim dance of destruction. This pervasive integration meant that the war was not something happening to civilians, a distant event to be read about in a newspaper. It was something they were living through every single moment, side by side with the armed forces, their lives equally imperiled, their routines equally shattered. The very concept of a civilian sphere, separate from the militaries, had dissolved completely, leaving everyone trapped in the same grim shared nightmare, united only by their common despair awaiting the inevitable end. The overwhelming scale of this collapse, this total societal unravelling, brutally reduced individual identity to an anonymous, undifferentiated struggle for mere survival. Soldiers, once defined by their names, their hometowns, their aspirations, became interchangeable, specks in the soup, defined more by their immediate proximity to danger, whether they were under fire or had a working weapon, than by their rank, their personal history, or any former sense of self. Your name, your dreams, your past accomplishments, the very essence of who you were, they all faded into insignificance, becoming irrelevant relics of a bygone era. What truly mattered was whether you could lift that heavy timber, whether you could still run from that sudden explosion, whether you could hold that improvised line against an overwhelming assault. This wasn't a deliberate act of dehumanization by an enemy, though that would come later. It was the natural, chilling consequence of total systemic failure, a terrifying anonymity imposed by the sheer crushing weight of destruction. You became part of a desperate, undifferentiated mass, a wave of humanity moving through the ruins, your individual story swallowed by the vast collective horror. It was a profound erasure of self, leaving behind only the raw biological imperative to endure, stripping away all but the most basic fundamental definition of existence, simply being, breathing, surviving. Post-capture, this loss of individual identity continued, even intensified, but under a starkly new order, the absolute, unyielding control of the Soviet forces. Here, a rigid, meticulously enforced hierarchy emerged, one that systematically reduced German soldiers to an undifferentiated mass processed and managed for forced labour with chilling efficiency. You were no longer a soldier of the Wehrmacht, no longer a reluctant Volkssturm member, no longer even a civilian. You were simply a prisoner, an expendable unit of labour, your individuality completely stripped away. Your identity was now a series of numbers, your purpose dictated entirely by the needs of your captors, your very existence reframed as a resource to be exploited. This reflected the complete brutal imposition of a new, absolute power structure, one that saw you not as a defeated combatant with a past, but as raw material, a mere component to be put to work. It was a cold, efficient system designed to extract maximum utility from a mass of defeated men, utterly devoid of recognition for their individual humanity, solidifying the profound transition from a collapsing internal structure to a new externally imposed unyielding command, a complete inversion of their previous lives. This redefinition of power would reshape even the most basic economic realities. That complete inversion of their previous lives, the chilling transition from a collapsing internal structure to a new externally imposed unyielding command, brought with it a complete redefinition of economic reality. In Berlin's final desperate days, the formal economy with its currency, its trade routes, its banks had of course utterly disintegrated, becoming as irrelevant as the morning newspaper. In its place, a brutal localized barter system had taken root, primal and unforgiving. Whatever you can grab without someone bleeding for it became the only unofficial currency, the only true medium of exchange. A handful of mouldy biscuits might fetch a torn, dirty blanket. A working lighter, a rare commodity, could be a miracle worth its weight in desperation. Value was no longer abstract, determined by market forces. It was intensely pragmatic, defined solely by immediate utility and the desperate gnawing needs of the moment. This wasn't just an economic recession. It was a wholesale return to a primal premonitory existence where the very concept of a stable economy was as utterly shattered as the city's infrastructure. Every single transaction was a precarious negotiation, a gamble against hunger, and the omnipresent threat of violence reflecting the complete collapse of established economic norms and the brutal, often heartbreaking revaluation of every tangible item, transforming heirlooms into bargaining chips for a few meagre calories. The city, bleeding out its last reserves, operated under an absolute pervasive principle of resource deprivation, a brutal scarcity that dictated every single aspect of existence. Food, fuel, medical supplies. These weren't just scarce. They were largely non-existent mythical concepts spoken of in hushed, yearning tones. Imagine trying to find a doctor or even a basic painkiller when the entire logistical system had evaporated into dust and smoke. This profound existential absence drove individuals to extreme, desperate acts to obtain the barest necessities. People rummaged through bombed-out stores, picking through debris, hoping to find a forgotten tin of food, risking their lives for a scrap of wood to burn or a few drops of stagnant water to drink. This wasn't merely a shortage. It was an existential void, a constant gnawing emptiness that forced survivors into a constant agonizing quest for the fundamentals of life. The city in its death throes became a vast, dangerous scavenger hunt, where every potential resource, no matter how unappetizing or perilous to acquire, was fiercely contested, and every success was fleeting, a temporary reprieve from inevitable slow deprivation. Survival was a daily, unending negotiation with absence. The physical infrastructure of the city itself was shattered beyond recognition, rendering transportation utterly useless. Imagine trying to navigate streets so pockmarked with rubble that even bicycles are nearly useless, their wheels snagging on concrete shards, their frames twisted by explosions. Cars were abandoned, burnt-out wrecks, monuments to a bygone era of movement. Public transport was a distant, almost mythical memory. Its rails twisted, its stations reduced to craters. This physical disintegration meant that vital supply lines were non-existent. There were no convoys bringing in food, no trains delivering medical aid, no trucks laden with fuel. The inevitable result was perpetual hunger, a gnawing constant companion that lived in your gut, and an acute, crippling lack of essential goods that paralyzed any attempt at organized survival. The very arteries of the city had been severed, leaving its inhabitants to bleed out slowly, isolated from any external support, any hope of relief. It was a city utterly cut off, dependent solely on the meagre decaying remnants found within its own dying confines. A terrifying example of how complete physical destruction directly translates into human suffering on a monumental, unimaginable scale, turning every day into a brutal test of endurance. That terrifying example of physical destruction directly translating into monumental human suffering was perhaps nowhere more starkly visible than in the ghastly, desperate barter system that replaced any semblance of a formal economy. Economic exchange in Berlin's final throes had devolved into a primal state, stripping items of their intrinsic sentimental value and imbuing them instead with a desperate immediate utility. Imagine if you can bear to trading something as profoundly symbolic and personally resonant as a wedding ring for a mere tin of sardines. This wasn't a casual transaction, a simple exchange of goods. It was a heartbreaking, soul-wrenching decision, illustrating the absolute collapse of traditional value systems, where love and commitment were suddenly less vital than calories. A family heirloom, a tangible symbol of enduring love and generations of commitment, became nothing more than a temporary means to stave off immediate starvation, a brutal calculation of survival. This revaluation was driven solely by immediate raw necessity, turning every possession into a potential lifeline, and every exchange into a desperate gamble against hunger, against death. It was a stark, brutal testament to how profoundly total war can distort human priorities, reducing sentiment, personal history, and deep emotional attachments to a mere cold calculation of caloric intake and momentary relief from suffering. Following capture, the chaotic, desperate bartering of Berlin quickly evaporated, replaced by the rigid, centrally imposed structure of the Arbeitsverband or labour camp. This new forced economy was a stark, efficient and centralised system, driven entirely by Soviet needs and demands. Here the grim equation was brutally simple basic shelter and soup with actual meat, a luxury almost forgotten from the pre-war world, were provided in direct exchange for the grueling, ceaseless work of rebuilding a shattered landscape. This wasn't charity, you understand. It was a cold, pragmatic transaction, a system of forced labour. You received just enough sustenance to keep you alive and capable of working no more, no less precisely calculated to maximise your utility as a resource. It was a controlled, utterly dehumanising system, where your labour was the only commodity, and your very existence was entirely conditional on your ability to perform the work demanded regardless of your physical condition or mental state. This transition from the chaotic, individualistic, desperate bartering of Berlin to the regimented, forced economy of the camp marked a profound shift from individual struggle to systemic exploitation. Yet in its own grim, paradoxical way, it offered a new if unwilling form of stability, a predictable routine of suffering, a stark contrast to the terrifying, lawless scramble for survival that had preceded it in the burning city. Amidst this grim reality, the city's iconic landmarks, once proud symbols of a powerful nation and a vibrant metropolis, now stood as poignant macroscopic monuments to a lost world of abundance and normalcy. Their very presence emphasized the profound, sweeping loss that had befallen Berlin. A burned-out kiosk might still display a faded, smoke-stained advertisement for chocolate and newspapers, a cruel, almost mocking reminder of everyday luxuries that now seemed impossibly distant, a relic from a bygone era when pleasure was possible. Or perhaps you'd stumble upon a brass luggage cart, waiting for guests who'll never check in, at a bombed-out hotel, its gleaming metal tarnished a ghostly relic from an era of travel leisure and ordinary human rhythms. These objects, once mundane, now carried an immense symbolic weight, serving as stark, silent monuments to a past that had been violently, irrevocably obliterated. They were not just damaged buildings or broken items. They were physical manifestations of a city's shattered dreams, emphasizing the profound collective trauma of a society that had lost not just its physical structures, its grand avenues and its cultural institutions, but its very way of life, its economic foundations and its entire sense of future, leaving behind only the ghosts of what once was. This profound collective trauma would soon be mirrored by nature's own relentless fury. That profound collective trauma, etched into the very stones of Berlin's ruined landmarks, signified more than just physical destruction. It heralded a fundamental shift in the very mechanisms of authority and control. This profound collective trauma was soon mirrored and indeed amplified by nature's own seemingly relentless fury, as if the very elements of Berlin itself colluded with human destruction in this tragic urban decay. Berlin, the very ground beneath your feet, transformed into a malevolent force, an active antagonist far more than just a passive backdrop for the conflict. It was described with chilling accuracy as a city split wide open, its very guts exposed, its inner workings laid bare in a horrifying spectacle. It became a bowl of fire, perpetually alight with the destructive flames of countless explosions and uncontrolled infernos, a constant infernal glow on the horizon. More than that, it morphed into a carcass, vast and decaying, a massive entity in its death throes, constantly groaning with the settling of ruins, whispering with the rustle of debris, and collapsing under its own immense weight. This wasn't just a place to inhabit. It was a living, breathing, dying entity of suffering, its very fabric asserting its own destructive will over its inhabitants. You moved through it not as an occupant, but as a small, insignificant part of its demise, constantly feeling its oppressive, decaying presence, its silent, destructive judgment like a suffocating shroud wrapped around your very being. Every creak of splintered wood, every shift in a pile of rubble, every distant rumble became part of a sinister, omnipresent symphony of decay designed to erode sanity as well as stone. The unceasing Soviet shelling, a relentless percussive beat to the city's demise, imposed a terrifying, almost mechanical rhythm of destruction. Imagine the sheer dread of hearing a breathless boom that shakes the ceiling every 30 seconds. Its dreadful regularity more horrifying in a strange way than any chaotic irregularity. This wasn't merely noise. It was a physical assault, the concussions vibrating through your very bones, threatening to liquefy your insides, your teeth chattering involuntarily. Each explosion would send down pulverized concrete like a fine, gritty ash, settling on everything: your hair, your clothes, your exposed skin, adding yet another layer to the pervasive grime, a fine, gritty shroud of dust. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the brief unnatural silence that would sometimes fall between barrages, a silence so profound it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Its cessation, that sudden pause in the cacophony, was often far more unsettling than its presence, creating a pervasive gnawing fear, a taut anticipation that stretched every nerve to its breaking point. Your body tensed with every pause, your mind racing, anticipating the next concussion, the next wave of destruction, the next arbitrary delivery of death from an unseen hand. This wasn't random violence. It was a meticulously orchestrated symphony of annihilation, designed not just to break buildings, but to break spirits, to strip away any last vestige of security and replace it with a constant, inescapable dread, a relentless countdown to the inevitable end. The very air men breathed in Berlin was an oppressive, suffocating presence, a choking atmosphere of decay that permeated everything, seemed to seep into every pore, every thought. It was damp, like it's trying to rot you alive from the inside out, a visceral sensation of internal decay that chillingly mirrored the city's external disintegration. Imagine the constant, acrid taste of smoke that tasted like copper in your mouth, a metallic, bitter tang that clung to your tongue. The air was perpetually thick with the stench of burning wires, scorched paint and sewage, a grim cocktail of chemical and organic decay that assaulted the nostrils and burned the lungs. The sky itself, obscured by the perpetual pall of smoke and dust, was a constant sickly grey-yellow, turning day into a perpetual dim twilight. where the sun was a forgotten deity. Every breath was a struggle, every inhalation a toxic cocktail of ash, dust and decay, reminding you that even the most fundamental act of living was a slow, agonizing consumption, a form of low-grade poisoning. This wasn't merely unpleasant, it was a constant, pervasive environmental antagonist that worked silently, insidiously, to wear down every last vestige of physical and mental resilience, ensuring that even the air itself conspired in the city's demise, wrapping you in its suffocating embrace, turning the very atmosphere into a tormentor. That suffocating embrace of the city's decay, a constant low-grade poisoning of the very air, was part of a larger perilous landscape that defined Berlin's final agony. The city itself was an open wound of rubble, its flesh torn, its bones exposed with crater fields, pockmarking every street, turning once familiar avenues into treacherous moonscapes. Skeletal buildings like grim sentinels of ruin clawed at a perpetually grey indifferent sky, their hollowed-out windows staring blankly at the destruction below. Movement through this chaotic landscape was treacherous, every single step, a calculated risk over uneven ground, jagged shards of glass and concrete and unseen pitfalls that could twist an ankle or worse. Cover once sought behind sturdy walls was illusory, as even the thickest facades offered little protection against direct hits, and what little remained standing often served as a grim trap liable to collapse at any moment. Imagine stumbling over twisted bikes, poignant rusted remnants of childhood games and simpler times, or the eerie sight of the occasional broken piano lying amidst the debris, its keys perhaps still capable of a dissonant mournful chord, if struck chilling symbols of civilian life scattered like forgotten confetti, each a testament to a life violently interrupted. These weren't just obstacles. They were stark, heartbreaking symbols of a world violently torn apart where the ordinary had been rendered extraordinary in its destruction. Each ruined object a silent, screaming testament to the indiscriminate nature of the city's demise, making the very ground you walked a treacherous, ever-changing battlefield. Beyond the direct bombardment and the ever-present physical dangers, systemic threats plagued the dying city with an almost total chilling absence of any formal relief efforts. Widespread famine stalked every street, a silent, pervasive killer that gnawed relentlessly at the insides of both soldiers and civilians alike, leaving them gaunt and hollow-eyed. The omnipresence of death was undeniable, a macabre presence in every alley and every pile of rubble, dead horses bloated in the streets, their bodies slowly decaying, unburied human bodies lying in the rubble. Their silence still forms a constant grim reminder of humanity's fragility and the brutal indifference of war. There were no aid organisations, no functioning medical services, no coordinated efforts to alleviate the suffering, no one to mourn the dead or tend to the wounded in any organised fashion. Individuals were left entirely to their own devices, forced to face an overwhelming, unforgiving environment alone or in small, desperate groups, each fighting their own private battle for survival. This wasn't merely a lack of resources, you see. It was a complete societal abandonment, leaving its inhabitants to face an overwhelming, unforgiving environment. With no external help or hope of organised relief, a city left to die slowly and painfully. Once proud symbols, the very heart and soul of German identity and national pride, now stood as grim symbolic monuments to the absolute physical and spiritual destruction of the city. The Reichstag, once a beacon of democracy and legislative power, and the Brandenburg Gate, a majestic arch of triumph and national unity, were now riddled with bullet holes, their magnificent facades scarred beyond recognition, weeping dust and broken stone. Decapitated statues, their marble forms shattered and defiled, lay scattered on the ground like discarded toys, their classical grandeur reduced to pathetic debris, their silent faces staring blankly at the sky. These weren't just architectural casualties, they were potent, visceral symbols of a nation's collapse. Its ideals shattered, its power utterly broken, its very soul laid bare. They stood as silent, enduring testaments to the final cataclysmic end of an era reflecting back to anyone who saw them. The profound, almost unimaginable scale of the city's physical and spiritual ruin, the very soul of Berlin laid bare in its destruction, a profound and tragic epitaph that heralded a shift in power. That profound and tragic epitaph, etched into the very stones of Berlin's ruined landmarks, signified more than just physical destruction. It heralded a fundamental shift in the very mechanisms of authority and control. From these overarching realities of collapse, the shattered landscape, the pervasive hunger, the relentless bombardment, a grim but tangible set of power dynamics emerged radically different from anything known in peacetime governing social control conflict and the desperate human responses within the dying city. In the final brutal days of Berlin, the mechanisms of power and control shifted dramatically from established governance and military doctrine to the raw visceral realities of immediate survival, direct brutal conflict, and the absolute imposition of a new order by the advancing Soviet forces. This wasn't merely a change in government. It was a fundamental redefinition of power itself, transforming from abstract authority laws and policies into the brutal, immediate, and often arbitrary immediacy of the battlefield. The very air seemed to hum with this new raw power, a stark contrast to the distant echoes of former authority, a chilling testament to who truly held sway. The formal power hierarchy of the Reich, once seemingly immutable, virtually disappeared on the ground, evaporating like mist in the face of overwhelming force and systemic failure. Hitler's distant presence in the Führer bunker, if he was even still there, became a phantom, a whisper holding absolutely no sway over the immediate terrifying reality of the street fighting. Military divisions, once the backbone of strategic command, dissolved into disconnected pockets of panic. Their soldiers left to fend for themselves without functional command or clear orders, their training rendered obsolete by the sheer chaos. Imagine the sheer futility of a general's directive when your immediate commander is dead, your unit scattered to the winds and the enemy is just around the next bombed-out corner, their unseen presence a constant threat. This wasn't merely a breakdown of discipline, it was a total collapse of the command structure itself, leaving individual soldiers to make life or death decisions in a vacuum of authority, reliant only on their immediate instincts and the desperate camaraderie of those fighting beside them. The very concept of a central authority, much less one capable of exerting control over this inferno, had become an anachronism, an absurd memory in the burning ruins of the capital, replaced by the relentless, brutal, unwritten law of sheer survival. The ubiquitous order to hold became a desperate, unyielding demand, a frantic cry cascading down a non-existent hierarchy, a futile command echoing hollowly in a city without a discernible front line. Think about it. How do you hold when the enemy's everywhere, when there's no clear front? Just a labyrinth of rubble fire and chaos where every shadow might conceal a threat. This command, stripped of all strategic meaning, was sustained not by genuine belief or a rational strategic imperative, but by sheer inertia, and overwhelmingly by fear. Fear of the advancing enemy certainly, but also a profound visceral fear of summary execution by your own side, if you dared to break ranks or show a flicker of retreat. It was a desperate plea for order in the face of utter disorder, a command that had lost all practical meaning clinging to existence by the thinnest of threads. The inherent futility of this constant order highlighted the profound disconnect between the official narrative and the lived agonizing reality of the soldiers who were fighting not for victory, which was a distant dream, but simply to delay the inevitable, a grim, drawn-out performance of a doomed resistance powered by despair rather than hope, a narrative that rang hollow. That narrative powered by despair rather than hope rang hollow, starkly underscored by the empty, almost mocking echo of propaganda. Official pronouncements of resilient morale and confident declarations like, "Victory will be ours," once potent tools of mass persuasion, became little more than cruel jokes, their grandiosity starkly juxtaposed against the grim, undeniable reality unfolding on the shattered streets. Imagine hearing these lofty slogans over a crackling, barely audible radio, perhaps from a bunker, somewhere deep beneath the city, while just outside buildings crumbled into dust, and comrades felt their lives extinguished with a sickening thud. This blatant disparity, this grotesque charade, demonstrated the complete and utter failure of psychological control over a populace and an army that had witnessed far too much, seen too many unspeakable horrors, and understood with agonizing clarity the true crushing weight of their hopeless situation. Propaganda, once a powerful tool of mobilization and ideological reinforcement, had lost all credibility, becoming instead a bitter symbol of the regime's profound detachment from its own dying people. The words rang hollow, resonating only with a profound sense of irony, cynicism, and a growing desperate weariness among those who knew the brutal, unvarnished truth of their inescapable fate, a truth that could not be silenced by false promises. In the profound and terrifying absence of any high command, or indeed any functioning command structure at all immediate authority, devolved by necessity to the most assertive or simply the most desperate individuals. Soldiers left without clear orders, without leaders, without even a sense of where the front truly was, simply found themselves drifting, following the person in front of you, their survival instincts replacing any semblance of tactical planning. This wasn't military strategy, you understand. It was a chaotic, improvised power dynamic, based purely on immediate necessity, on the desperate primal hope that anyone knew what they were doing, or at least appeared to. A particularly determined sergeant, a battle-hardened veteran who had seen too much, or even just the most vocal and seemingly resolute individual in a shattered group, might assume de facto leadership, for a few precious minutes their voice cutting through the din of chaos, only for that fragile authority to dissolve with the next shell or the next sudden enemy encounter. There was no real structure, no accountability, just a fluid, constantly shifting hierarchy of whoever happened to be alive, and giving orders at any given moment, a terrifying testament to the total breakdown of centralized control and the descent into a desperate every man for himself scramble for survival, thinly veiled by the illusion of group cohesion. Upon capture the moment the fighting ceased, and the triumphant Soviet forces appeared, German soldiers instantly submitted to a new unyielding power hierarchy, one that was cold, absolute, and entirely external. Soviet officers, their faces often unreadable, devoid of emotion, symbolizing a chilling, impenetrable control, conducted formal interrogations. You weren't a person with a history, a name, a family. You were reduced to a data point, your identity meticulously extracted, and processed your fate, now entirely and unequivocally in the hands of this new implacable power. There was no room for defiance, no possibility of negotiation, no appeal to any former status. The very act of interrogation, cold, dispassionate, and relentless, was a stark, brutal display of absolute authority, reinforcing the total loss of individual agency of self-determination. This was the imposition of order, by sheer overwhelming force, a crushing weight of command that left no room for question, no possibility of resistance, establishing a new absolute reality for the defeated one entirely beyond their control, where justice was a distant, forgotten concept. That new absolute reality for the defeated, where justice was a distant, forgotten concept, meant that the crushing weight of externally imposed command continued to define existence, even in the chilling semblance of peace that followed capture. Here the power of life and death remained terrifyingly arbitrary. Names were called for unknown purposes, whispered perhaps by a guard, or shouted across a crowded, desolate yard, creating a constant low hum of apprehension that vibrated through the very air. Individuals could simply disappear without explanation, swallowed by the camp's opaque and brutal system, their sudden unexplained absence serving as a terrifying warning to others, a silent promise of the same fate. This demonstrated the absolute unpredictable nature of the new imposed order, where existence was a game of chance, causing immense pervasive emotional distress and reinforcing a profound, pervasive sense of helplessness. You learn to live with this constant uncertainty, the gnawing knowledge that your fate could change irrevocably at any moment for reasons entirely beyond your comprehension or control, dependent only on the whim of your captors. This wasn't a system of fairness. It was raw power exercised with chilling indifference, making every day a precarious gamble against an unseen all-consuming force, turning hope itself into a dangerous illusion. During the actual combat, justice was immediate and brutal, administered not by courts or legal codes, but by the swift, unforgiving hand of war itself, a grim, visceral tribunal. A soldier who hesitated, who showed a flicker of weakness in their eyes, or who broke formation faced instant lethal consequences, often from enemy fire from a sniper's bullet, or from the brutal efficiency of a flamethrower. There was no recourse, no due process, no appeal, only the immediate final judgment of a bullet or a blast delivered with terrifying impartiality. The battlefield was its own stark courtroom, delivering summary sentences with terrifying efficiency, a constant brutal reminder of the ultimate stakes. This wasn't a system of law in any civilized sense. It was a primal struggle where rules were written in blood and enforced by the relentless immediate pressure of survival. The complete absence of traditional justice mechanisms meant that every action, every decision, every micro-movement carried immediate life or death stakes, stripping away any illusion of order, fairness, or individual rights. The only law was survival, and its enforcement was absolute, a chilling and unyielding truth. In the labour camp, a de facto collective punishment often replaced individual accountability, a brutal and effective mechanism for social control, grimly reinforcing the reality of diminished personal agency. The Goningumi system, for instance, a Japanese 5-person group responsibility system, where the actions of one affected all, found its chilling parallel in the shared suffering of the German prisoners. If one man, driven by desperation, stole a piece of bread, the absence of food for the entire camp for a period would exemplify a collective punishment, a brutal immediate consequence imposed on everyone irrespective of their individual involvement or guilt. This wasn't merely about deterrence, it was about fostering an intense, pervasive sense of collective responsibility, ensuring that every individual was acutely aware of the potentially devastating consequences of another's transgression. It was a cruel but remarkably effective mechanism of control, turning prisoners against each other, fostering suspicion and self-policing, all while highlighting the profound, absolute lack of individual rights or any ability to appeal a collective decision. The suffering became a shared burden enforced from above, stripping away personal agency for the sake of mass control where even minor infractions carried severe consequences. That shared burden of suffering enforced from above where even minor infractions carried severe consequences extended to the most public and brutal displays of power in the labour camp. Here formal transgressions were met with chilling public punishments, designed not just to punish, but to serve as a stark visceral display of raw, unquestionable authority. Imagine men being beaten, not to death, just close enough in front of everyone, their cries echoing through the yard, the sickening thud of the blows, a grim soundtrack to their humiliation. This wasn't merely about retribution for an infraction. It was a carefully orchestrated spectacle, a chilling demonstration of who held absolute arbitrary power over life and limb. The grim purpose was to instill pervasive fear, to break any remaining will, to resist and to enforce a rigid, absolute code of obedience through visceral, undeniable pain. Witnessing such brutality was a constant harrowing reminder of your own profound vulnerability, a psychological assault that aimed to crush defiance and hope before it could even fully form in the minds of the prisoners. It underscored the absolute absence of due process of human dignity, or any legal recourse, replacing them with the arbitrary public imposition of force, a stark testament to the total subjugation of the individual. Indeed, the very act of capture itself meant the complete and instantaneous cessation of individual rights, a brutal redefinition of one's legal and human status. Prisoners were herded like livestock, stripped not only of their personal belongings, their uniforms and their names, but also of their very humanity, reduced to an anonymous mass. They were subject to forced labour, as we've discussed their bodies mere tools to be used, but also to arbitrary separation from comrades, the few remaining familiar faces and the chilling ever-present threat of summary executions. On the spot, no trial. This wasn't a temporary suspension of rights, a wartime measure. It was their complete and utter obliteration. You existed entirely at the whim of your captors, your life reduced to a precarious balance, dependent entirely on their unpredictable decisions, their inscrutable moods. This dehumanization was systematic, pervasive and total, designed to break the will and enforce absolute compliance, transforming men into mere components of a vast forced labour machine, utterly devoid of any legal or moral standing, a chilling example of power exercised without restraint. The labour camp enforced a rigid, unyielding code of conduct, a strict set of rules that governed every conceivable aspect of daily life, from the moment you woke to the moment you collapsed into exhausted sleep. Violations, even minor ones, often led to terrifyingly unexplained disappearances. No fighting, no escape attempts, no speaking to civilians, no mention of Hitler, Himmler or the Reich. These were not mere suggestions or guidelines. They were commandments etched into the very atmosphere of the camp, enforced with an iron fist. The punishment for infractions wasn't always a public beating. Sometimes a man would simply vanish, swallowed by the camp's opaque system, leaving behind only his empty bunk and a chilling, unnerving silence that spoke volumes. This pervasive uncertainty, this terrifying unpredictability created an atmosphere of constant apprehension and fear, a psychological control far more insidious than any physical chain or barbed wire fence. You walked a tightrope every single day, acutely aware that any misstep, any perceived transgression, any hint of disobedience could lead to your total, unexplained erasure from existence, transforming fear into an all-consuming, inescapable element of your daily life, the very air you breathed and the psychological torment it brought. That all-consuming, inescapable element of fear, the very air you breathed, permeated every moment of existence, for the most pervasive form of control was psychological, the constant gnawing uncertainty of one's ultimate fate. Imagine waking up each day not knowing if it would be your last, or if you would be called out for an interrogation, sent to a more brutal prison camp, or simply marched to a shallow grave, dug in some forgotten corner of the vast anonymous landscape. This relentless unpredictability kept prisoners in a perpetual state of submission, their wills slowly eroded by the constant apprehension. This wasn't just about physical confinement. It was about mental imprisonment, the mind constantly wrestling with a future that was utterly opaque, terrifying, and entirely out of their hands. This psychological torment embodied the total loss of control, reducing individuals to a state of profound helplessness, where their very thoughts were consumed by the terrifying unpredictability of their new existence, turning hope into a dangerous, almost foolish luxury. It was a deeply unsettling yet incredibly effective means of ensuring compliance, a slow, agonizing process of breaking the spirit through relentless uncertainty. Beyond these overt displays of power and the immediate brutal struggle for physical survival, the subtle, enduring elements of social fabric, culture, and human connection, though severely tested, stretched thin, and often fractured, continued to shape the inner lives of those who remained. Even as the city burned and the formal structures of power crumbled into dust, an implicit social fabric resilient as forgotten weeds pushing through concrete persisted. It wove its way through the desperate, often non-verbal communications, the quiet rituals of endurance that offered small comforts, and the fractured yet enduring bonds of family and identity, shaping the inner world of the German soldier in ways that external forces could not entirely extinguish. It was a testament to the stubborn inherent human need for connection, for meaning beyond mere existence. In Berlin, during its final apocalyptic throes, verbal communication became a dangerous luxury, an unnecessary expenditure of precious energy, and a potential liability. Talking has become risky because words cost energy, a resource in painfully short supply for bodies constantly on the edge of collapse. This brutal reality led to a pervasive unspoken language of glances and the unspoken agreement. Between comrades, a quiet understanding forged in mutual despair and shared trauma. A single shared look could convey more than 100 spoken words, an acknowledgement of shared fear, shared hunger, shared determination, or simply shared exhaustion. The very act of speaking once effortless and taken for granted was now weighed against its potential cost, turning silence into the dominant, safest language of survival. This wasn't just about conserving physical energy, it was about conserving emotional energy, protecting oneself from the vulnerability and exposure that open communication might entail in a world riddled with suspicion and danger. The city's desolation forced a new minimalist form of social interaction, where non-verbal cues reigned supreme, and trust, if it existed at all, was built on shared unarticulated suffering, rather than on explicit declarations or empty promises. It was a language born of necessity, understood in the gut more than in the mind, a testament to bonds forged in the furnace of collective terror, where truth itself was perilous. That silent language born of necessity and understood in the gut more than in the mind meant that expressing honest opinions or showing any genuine weakness became a truly perilous act fraught with unseen dangers. Propaganda slogans relentlessly broadcast over crackling loudspeakers and plastered on crumbling walls might be met with bitter internal derision by the soldiers, a silent, boiling cynicism that tasted like ash in their mouths. But to voice that dissent, to speak the truth of their despair, their doubts about the collapsing Reich, or to show a flicker of fear was an unthinkable risk. An unspoken rigid etiquette of stoicism and compliance was enforced not necessarily by formal military discipline, which had largely disintegrated, but by the raw, brutal demands of survival and the omnipresent threat of harsh, immediate reprisal. You simply didn't complain, didn't question, didn't show fear, at least not openly. To do so was to invite scrutiny, suspicion, or worse, to undermine the fragile collective illusion that kept everyone going, that prevented utter anarchy. So the truth remained unspoken, locked behind weary eyes and tight lips, a heavy suffocating burden carried by each individual lest a flicker of honesty cost them their life or the lives of those around them. It was a societal pressure cooker where authenticity was a luxury no one could afford, and silent suffering became the ultimate grim form of self-preservation, a constant performance of unyielding resolve. Amidst this profound peril of truth and the relentless pressure of stoicism, a peculiar phenomenon emerged as a vital if bleak coping mechanism: grim humour. This wasn't the robust, hearty laughter of peacetime, the kind that fills a room with genuine warmth. Instead, humour became hollow and static, a desperate brain discharge of leftover energy, a nervous tick of the soul. It was less about genuine joy or amusement, and more about a bleak, almost involuntary response to the crushing absurdity and horror of their situation. Imagine a soldier, perhaps shivering uncontrollably, in a flooded, putrid cellar, making a dry, sardonic crack about, "At least we won't die of thirst," or a darkly humorous remark about an incoming shell having our name on it, followed by a mirthless chuckle that dissolved into a cough. These were not jokes meant to uplift spirits or inspire camaraderie in the usual sense. They were bleak punchlines born of profound exhaustion, despair, and the chilling proximity of death serving as a raw, almost reflex-like coping mechanism. It was a way to momentarily release the unbearable tension, to acknowledge the omnipresence of death, without fully succumbing to its terror, to look the abyss in the eye and offer a twisted grin. This wasn't the kind of humour you'd find in a comedy club. It was the gallows humour of men living on borrowed time, a grim, almost reflex-like attempt to impose a sliver of emotional control over circumstances that were utterly and terrifyingly uncontrollable. This strained, often non-verbal communication also extended to the fractured and frequently broken dialogue with civilians. In those final brutal days, direct communication between soldiers and the city's remaining inhabitants was almost non-existent, replaced by suspicion and fear. Civilians, weary beyond measure and wary of anyone in uniform, actively avoid soldiers, seeing them perhaps as harbingers of destruction, or simply as desperate, unpredictable figures to be steered clear of. And when interactions did occur, when paths inevitably crossed, they could often devolve into open raw verbal abuse. An old man, his voice raspy with resentment and grief, might emerge from the shadows to call a soldier a murderer, a fool, a uniformed disgrace, his words stinging more than any physical blow because they carried the crushing weight of a shattered trust of profound betrayal. This wasn't just a simple lack of communication. It was a profound societal fissure, an emotional chasm that divided those fighting or forced to fight from those merely trying to survive civilians caught in the crossfire. The quiet accusation in their eyes or the venom in their words highlighted a deep, unbridgeable divide, a reflection of the civilians' profound suffering and their bitter conviction that the soldiers, by their very presence, by their desperate, futile fight, were the ultimate cause of their unending misery and the city's final agony. This bitter, silent indictment would soon find its echoes in the silent resistance of the populace. That bitter, silent indictment echoing in the quiet resistance of the populace highlighted the complex and painful truth that suffering itself could be the catalyst for dissent, even if it wasn't organised rebellion. The relentless war, not taxation or abstract political grievances, was the fundamental, undeniable root cause of civilian suffering, driving individuals to desperate acts of individual resistance and undermining any remaining loyalty to a state that had failed them so catastrophically. Imagine the profound disillusionment, the raw fury that would fester in the hearts of people who had lost everything, their homes, their loved ones, their very sense of security, all for a cause that now seemed utterly lost and meaningless. This suffering, constant and pervasive, eroded any lingering patriotism, replacing it with a quiet, burning resentment against the forces that had brought such devastation upon them. While organised icky peasant uprisings from a different historical context, but here highlighting forms of popular discontent, a large-scale coordinated rebellion was impossible in the utter chaos of Berlin. Individual acts of defiance were potent if unpunished expressions of rebellion. Open verbal attacks from civilians like that old man calling the soldier a murderer, a fool, a uniformed disgrace, represented powerful, searing acts of individual rebellion against the perceived source of their misery. These were not calls to arms, but deeply personal denunciations, cutting to the very core of a soldier's dwindling sense of purpose or honour. They were acts of courage born of desperation, a civilian's refusal to be silenced even when facing a man with a rifle. These quiet, isolated moments of direct confrontation, though lacking in strategic impact, were profound in their moral weight, shaking the very foundations of the soldier's self-perception, a stark, uncomfortable truth. Civilians subtly defied authority, not through grand gestures, but through quiet disregard, a pervasive form of dissent through non-compliance. They simply avoided soldiers, turning down alleys, disappearing into bombed-out buildings, a silent statement of rejection. They ignored official Zutritt verboten no entry signs on their relentless, desperate search for survival, scavenging for food or water wherever they could find it. This wasn't outright defiance, but a pervasive passive resistance, a quiet undermining of control born of sheer necessity. Their actions spoke louder than words, embodying a pervasive form of dissent that chipped away at the state's authority simply by ignoring it, prioritizing immediate survival over any lingering obedience to a crumbling regime. It was a subtle, persistent rebellion, widespread and deeply ingrained, a quiet refusal to participate in the charade of order, a quiet revolution of indifference. For the soldiers themselves, official propaganda, once designed to inspire and control, was now met with bitter cynicism and profound internal derision. The inability to laugh at the bombastic slogans about victory without choking on the irony was a poignant sign of a profound internalized rebellion against the state's false narrative. They understood the lies, they saw the reality, and the disconnect bred a deep-seated contempt. This wasn't an open mutiny, but a psychological one fought in the minds and hearts of men who knew the truth of their doomed struggle. Their silent scorn was a powerful testament to the failure of the regime's psychological manipulation, a quiet, pervasive form of dissent that gnawed away at the very foundations of loyalty, eroding the last vestiges of belief. In this landscape of despair, small acts of kindness, seemingly insignificant gestures, became profound acts of subversion against the brutalizing reality. An anonymous hand leaving a tin of supplies with a simple poignant note, "Für wenn es braucht," for whoever needs it. This wasn't charity in the usual sense. It was a silent affirmation of shared humanity, amidst the chaos, a desperate attempt to cling to moral values when all others had dissolved. These were quiet rebellions against the dehumanization of war acts of compassion that transcended the brutal divisions of uniforms and allegiances, offering a glimpse of an enduring human connection beyond the conflict. The most profound form of individual resistance often came from unexpected quarters. The old woman, for instance, who hid the soldier from Soviet patrols, who fabricated a convincing story to protect him, risking her own life for a stranger, a man who was technically her enemy. This wasn't about politics or ideology. It was an act driven solely out of profound, unadulterated compassion in a world stripped bare of it. Her courage in extending humanity to someone on the opposing side was a powerful wordless statement against the savagery of war, a testament to the enduring power of empathy, a quiet, profound subversion of the narrative of hatred and conflict. It was a beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness, proving that humanity could indeed persist amidst the ruin. Through these shattered fragments of culture and connection, the soldier once defined solely by the horror and dehumanization of war slowly began to reclaim a fragmented sense of self, a quiet testament to the enduring human spirit, even in the absolute depths of ruin. This journey from anonymity to a fragile rediscovery of self marked the true quiet triumph of the human spirit over the overwhelming forces of destruction. And with that final bitter indictment echoing softly in the silence of a collapsing city, and the subtle, profound acts of human resilience coming to the fore, our journey through Berlin's last desperate days draws to a close. It's a heavy history, isn't it? A narrative woven from dust, hunger and despair, certainly, but also a profound testament to the unimaginable depths of suffering that conflict can bring, and the stubborn, quiet ways humanity persists. As you let the details of those shattered streets, the gnawing emptiness of hunger, and the quiet acts of desperation and kindness gently recede from your mind, allow yourself to feel the peaceful, palpable contrast of your own space. The soft hum of your home, perhaps the gentle glow of a lamp, the comforting weight of your blanket, the steady, easy rhythm of your own breath. These are the simple yet profound comforts that those in our story in that dying city could only dream of, could only remember as distant, fading echoes. Notice the quiet stillness around you, the blessed absence of distant artillery, the gentle, reassuring glow of a bedside lamp that never falters, never threatens to extinguish. Let the harsh, stark images of crumbling walls, of weary, dust-caked faces, and the pervasive stench of decay softly fade from your mind's eye, replaced instead by the soft contours of your own familiar surroundings, the comforting sense of your own quiet space. The very air you breathe you realize is clean, untainted by smoke, or the metallic tang of fear, a simple, incredible gift that was once a precious, almost unattainable luxury. As your body relaxes, sinking deeper into the warmth and embrace of your bed, allow yourself to remember that the resilience you've just read, about the quiet strength that endured such unimaginable hardship, is also a powerful part of the human story, a testament to our profound capacity to find light, however dim, even in the deepest, most suffocating shadows. Allow that thought to settle gently, warm and comforting, a soft whisper, against the backdrop of your own peace, as you drift effortlessly towards a peaceful, undisturbed sleep wrapped in the quiet certainty and tender mercies of your present.